I was 29 when I took the job. It wasn't anything special, just temporary work at a logging site deep in the mountains of northern Montana. A buddy of mine had done a season there the year before, and he told me it was good money if I didn't mind isolation and long hours. I'd been drifting between jobs, so I figured why not. The company put us up in cabins spread out along the tree line, about a mile from the main logging camp. There were about 20 of us, but the cabins were spaced apart to keep things quiet. Most of the guys shared, but I got lucky and had mine to myself. It was a simple place: wooden walls, a cot, a small table, and a stove for heat. No running water. We used a communal shower and restroom near the main camp. It wasn't bad, just lonely. But I liked lonely. We worked long hours, 6 days a week, 10 to 12 hours a day, cutting down trees and hauling logs. The cold bit at my hands in the mornings, even through my gloves. The air smelled of pine and sap, mixed with the diesel from our equipment. Most nights, I was too tired to do anything but eat and sleep. The isolation didn't bother me at first, but then little things started happening. It was the second week when I noticed something was off. At first, it was just small stuff. My boots weren't where I left them, my tools had been moved. I chalked it up to exhaustion, maybe just forgetting. But then I started feeling like I was being watched. When I walked back to my cabin at night, I'd get this creeping sensation, like someone was just behind me. The trees pressed in from both sides of the trail, their trunks black against the sky. I'd look back, but there was nothing, just the wind through the pines, the crunch of snow under my boots. One night, I woke up to a noise outside, a shuffling sound, like something heavy moving just beyond the walls. I lay still, holding my breath. My rifle was leaning against the wall near my cot, but I didn't move to grab it. The sound stopped. I waited, staring at the ceiling, listening. Minutes passed. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling my cabin. I sat up. The only light came from the embers in the stove, casting an orange glow against the walls. I reached for my rifle, heart hammering. The footsteps stopped near the window. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then 3 knocks. Soft, careful. I stayed frozen. I didn't answer. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the window, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, I heard the crunch of footsteps retreating into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I told myself it was probably one of the guys messing with me, maybe a prank. But no one said anything at work, and when I asked around, nobody admitted to it. That day, I noticed something else. Tracks in the snow. They led from the tree line to my cabin, circled around it, then back into the woods. They were human, bare feet. No shoes, no boots. The skin must have been frozen solid. I stared at them for a long time before covering them up with fresh snow. I didn't want to think about it. The next few nights were quiet, but the feeling never went away. The sense of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck standing up when I walked back from camp. Then it happened again. This time, I woke up to my door creaking open. I had locked it. I was sure of it. I grabbed my rifle and sat up, aiming at the dark rectangle of the doorway. The cold air rushed in, but I couldn't see anything beyond the threshold. Just the trees and snow, the wind shifting through the branches. I stood slowly, stepping toward the door. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Then I saw them, a figure standing just beyond the tree line. Tall, thin, not moving. I couldn't make out a face, just a dark shape against the snow. I raised the rifle. My hands shook. It didn't move, just stood there. I don't know how long I aimed before I finally backed inside and slammed the door. I locked it, shoved my cot against it, then sat with my back to the wall, gripping the rifle until my fingers ached. I didn't sleep. When the sun came up, the figure was gone, but there were prints in the snow again. bare feet leading to my door, standing there, then walking away. I went straight to the foreman that morning, told him someone was messing around the cabins at night. He listened, nodding slowly, then sighed. "You're not the first," he said. He told me that over the years, other workers had seen things. Strange figures in the woods, things moving at night, but they never found anyone, never caught anyone. "Probably some hermit," he said. "Some guy living out there watching us. Happens more than you think." That didn't make me feel any better. That night, I stayed up with the rifle. I didn't turn out the light. I kept the stove burning, listening for any sound outside. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of breathing, right outside the window. Slow, deep. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. The breathing stayed for what felt like forever. Then came the knock. Soft, careful, just like before. I didn't answer. I never answered. Eventually, the breathing faded. The snow crunched. The thing, whatever it was, walked away. When morning came, I packed my things. I told the foreman I was done. I didn't care about the money. I didn't care about the job. I left that same day, driving down the long, empty road, away from the mountains, away from the trees. I never went back, and I never stopped thinking about those footprints in the snow. I hadn't been to the old family cabin in years. It was tucked deep in the woods of northern Maine, miles away from anything, just a small wooden place my grandfather had built with his own hands. He used it for hunting and fishing back in the day. Then my father took over, and now it was mine. I had been putting off visiting for a long time, mostly because life got in the way. Work, relationships, the usual excuses. But this year, I made the time. I needed a break, something to clear my head. A week alone in the woods, away from everything, seemed like the perfect reset. I packed up my truck with supplies, canned food, bottled water, a sleeping bag, extra clothes, and my old hunting rifle. I wasn't planning on hunting, but it felt wrong to go out there without it. The drive was long, nearly 6 hours, and the roads got rougher the further I went. By the time I turned onto the narrow dirt road leading to the cabin, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. The place looked exactly as I remembered, small, weathered, with a sagging porch and a stone chimney. The paint had peeled off in places, but it was still standing strong. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, the scent of old wood and dampness hanging in the air. I set my bags down, opened a few windows to let in fresh air, and started checking around. The cabin had one main room with a wood stove in the corner, a simple kitchen, and a small bedroom in the back. It was basic, but it had everything I needed. I spent the first night getting settled, chopping some firewood, making a simple meal, and sitting on the porch with a beer. The woods around me were quiet, the only sounds coming from the wind in the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was peaceful. I hadn't felt this relaxed in a long time, but that changed the next day. It started with small things. I woke up to find the front door slightly open. I was sure I had locked it the night before, but maybe I hadn't latched it properly. I brushed it off, closed it, and went about my morning. I made coffee, stepped outside to breathe in the crisp air, and decided to take a walk. There was an old trail that led deeper into the woods, one my grandfather used to take when he went hunting. I figured I'd follow it for a bit, get a feel for the land again. About a mile in, I noticed something strange. The trees were marked, long, deep scratches running down the bark. Not claw marks, but something made with a blade. A knife, maybe. The cuts were fresh, the wood underneath still pale and raw. I ran my fingers over one of them, feeling the rough edges. Someone had been here recently. The thought put me on edge. The cabin was remote, and as far as I knew, no one had been out this way for years. The land technically belonged to me, but it wasn't like I had a fence or posted signs to keep people out. Still, it felt wrong. I turned back, walking faster than before. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something else. My axe was missing. I had left it outside the night before, stuck in the chopping block. Now it was gone. I searched around, checked the porch, even looked in the trees nearby. Nothing. That's when I saw the footprints. They weren't mine. The prints were large, deep in the dirt, leading from the tree line to the cabin and back. I crouched down, looking closer. They were fresh. Someone had been here while I was gone. I felt my stomach tighten. I went inside, locked the door, and grabbed my rifle. I wasn't panicking. Maybe it was a hiker, someone lost, passing through, but something about it felt off. I stayed inside for a while, listening, waiting. The woods were silent. That night, I barely slept. I kept the rifle close, my ears tuned to every sound outside. Around midnight, I heard something moving in the trees. Slow, deliberate steps, twigs snapping underfoot. I held my breath, heart pounding. Then the footsteps stopped. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. After a long time, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the morning light streaming through the window. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the area. Nothing seemed disturbed, but when I walked to the tree line, I found something that made my blood run cold. The axe was stuck in a tree. Not just stuck, wedged deep into the wood, as if someone had swung it with all their strength. The handle was at an angle, the blade buried. Someone had done this on purpose. I yanked it out, gripping the handle tight. That was the moment I decided I wasn't staying another night. I went back inside, packed my things, and loaded up the truck. But as I was about to leave, I noticed something in the distance. A man, standing just beyond the trees. He was tall, thin, dressed in dark clothes. His face was shadowed by the branches, but I could see that he was watching me. I didn't move, neither did he. We stared at each other for what felt like forever. Then, slowly, he turned and walked back into the woods. I didn't wait to see where he went. I got in the truck, started the engine, and drove. Fast. The whole way back, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see him standing on the side of the road. But I never did. I didn't stop until I was back home, locking the doors behind me. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who he was or what he wanted. Maybe it was just some drifter, someone living off the land. But something about it didn't feel right. I still think about it sometimes, especially at night when the house is quiet. The way he stood there, the way he watched, and the way he made sure I knew he was there. I had no reason to drive past that road anymore. Not for years. But life has a way of forcing you to face things you thought you'd left behind. It was late October, cold and damp. The kind of weather that chills you all the way through, no matter how many layers you wear. I was heading back from a job out west, a long haul that had taken more out of me than I expected. My mind was tired, my body even more so, and I just wanted to be home. But when I checked my GPS, I saw the usual route was jammed up with traffic, some accident clogging the highway for miles. I didn't think much of it at first. I just tapped on an alternate route without looking too hard. I wanted to get moving, get back on the road. It wasn't until I was about 20 miles in that I realized where I was heading. That road, that damn road. It had been over 6 years since I had last been there, since I had last seen that cabin. I hadn't thought about it in a long time, at least not actively, but my stomach tightened the second I realized where my tires were taking me. I almost turned around, almost, but it was late and I was exhausted. The detour was already set. I told myself I'd just pass through, not even glance at the place. Just another stretch of road. Nothing more. The trees thickened as I drove on, the pavement turning rougher. This was an old road, barely maintained, only used by the few stubborn folks still living up in the woods. It was isolated, quiet, the kind of quiet that made your own breathing sound too loud. I knew exactly where the cabin would be, just around a bend past a small bridge, tucked back behind a clearing. I could already picture it in my head. The dark wood, the sagging porch, the broken window that never got fixed. I tightened my grip on the wheel. The rain had started again. Light at first, just a mist against the windshield. Then harder, the wipers working in a steady rhythm. I focused on the road, on the glow of my headlights cutting through the dark. But I could feel it coming, that moment when I'd have to pass it. And then there it was. First, it looked the same. That same hunched over look, like the weight of time had been pressing down on it. The driveway was overgrown, weeds climbing over the gravel. The porch sagged even more now, the roof dark with rot. But something was different. The door was open, not wide, just a crack. A sliver of darkness barely visible through the rain. I told myself it was the wind, the weather. Maybe some animal had nosed its way inside, looking for shelter. But I knew that wasn't true. That door had been locked when we left it. The kind of old, heavy lock that didn't just fall apart. I slowed down. I didn't want to, but my foot eased off the gas before I could stop it. My headlights swept across the cabin, lighting it up for just a second. And in that second, I saw something else. Footprints. Not old ones. Fresh. Leading up to the door, disappearing inside. I don't know why I stopped. Any sane person would have kept driving. But something in me, curiosity, stupidity, whatever you want to call it, made me pull over. The second I did, I regretted it. The rain hammered down as I stepped out, soaking through my jacket instantly. The cold bit into my skin, my breath fogging up in the air. I could barely see through the darkness, but I could feel it. That heaviness, that wrongness. I took a step forward, then another. The footprints were deep, pressed into the mud. A man's, maybe, big, but there was something off about them. The spacing was strange, uneven, like whoever made them wasn't walking normally. I stopped at the porch. The wood groaned under my weight. The door was still open, just barely. I could hear the wind creaking through the old beams, the rain dripping somewhere inside. The air smelled damp, stale, like something had been sitting there for too long. I don't know what I expected to see. Maybe some drifter, someone squatting in an abandoned place. Maybe just emptiness. But when I pushed the door open, my stomach dropped. It wasn't empty. Someone had been living there. The inside was a mess. Not just old and broken down, but disturbed. The furniture had been moved, the dust wiped away in places. A sleeping bag was rolled out in the middle of the floor, dirty and damp. Empty food cans were scattered around, some rusted, some still fresh. Whoever they were, they hadn't been gone long. The worst part was the smell. Not just mildew, but something sour, something rotten. It clung to the walls, to the floor, to the air itself. I should have left right then. Turned around, walked back out, driven away without looking back. But then I saw it. The pictures. They were laid out on the table, neat, careful. Pictures of me. Not old ones. Recent. Me at work. Me at the store. Me getting into my truck. Someone had been watching me, following me. My heart pounded. My skin went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the rain. I backed up, slow, careful. I didn't turn my back. My gut told me not to. Then I heard it. A rustling. From the back room. Someone was still here. I didn't think. I ran. I hit the porch hard, nearly slipping on the wet wood. My tires kicked up mud as I threw myself into the truck. My hands shaking so bad I almost dropped the keys. The engine roared to life, the headlights slicing through the dark. And that's when I saw him, just for a second. A figure standing in the doorway, tall, still, watching. I didn't stay to get a better look. I floored it, the truck fishtailing on the wet road before catching traction. I drove faster than I should have, my knuckles white on the wheel. I didn't slow down, not until I was miles away, until the trees thinned out and the lights of a gas station came into view. I sat there for a long time, the engine idling, my breath coming too fast. I don't know who he was. I don't know how long he had been following me, but I knew one thing for sure. That wasn't the last time I'd see him, and next time I might not be lucky enough to get away. I had never been a fan of cabins. There was something unsettling about being alone in the woods, miles away from the next person, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was the way the darkness felt heavier in places like that. But when my dad's friend, a man named Tom, invited me to spend a weekend at his cabin, I figured I might as well go. Tom had owned the place for years. He used it mostly for hunting trips or just to get away from the noise of the city. My dad had been up there with him plenty of times and always said it was peaceful. Good place to clear your head, he told me. Tom's got everything set up, solar power, a water pump, propane stove. It's not roughing it too bad. I had no reason to say no. I wasn't doing much that weekend, and a break from everything sounded nice. So, I packed my bag, filled up my truck, and drove out to the middle of nowhere. Tom had given me directions. It was about a 4-hour drive out of town, through a long stretch of highway, then down a winding dirt road that cut deep into the forest. He told me the nearest store was about 20 miles away, so I made sure to bring plenty of food and water. By the time I got there, the sun was already setting. The cabin was just how I imagined it. Small, sturdy, made of dark wood, with a covered porch and a stone chimney. It sat in a clearing, surrounded by thick pines that stretched in every direction. There was an old fire pit out front, a stack of chopped wood by the door, and an old rusted pickup parked off to the side, which I assumed was Tom's. Tom wasn't there when I arrived. He had told me he might be out hunting when I got in, so I let myself in. The inside was just as rustic as I expected. Wood paneling, a simple kitchen, a few mismatched chairs, and a couch that had seen better days. There were animal heads mounted on the walls, a rifle rack near the door, and a heavy iron stove in the corner. I set my bag down in the small bedroom and stepped outside to get some air. The woods were quiet, the kind of silence you only find in places like that. No cars, no distant hum of traffic, just the wind moving through the trees. It was peaceful, but at the same time it felt off. I shook the feeling off, chalking it up to just being alone in an unfamiliar place. I made myself something to eat, sat out on the porch for a while, and then decided to call it a night. That's when things started to feel wrong. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it, a sound outside, faint but unmistakable, footsteps on the dry leaves. At first, I thought it might just be an animal. The woods were full of deer, raccoons, and other things that could make noise at night. But the sound was steady, slow, deliberate, like someone was walking just beyond the tree line. I sat up, my heart suddenly pounding. I listened, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but then I heard it again, closer this time. I got up, grabbed the flashlight from my bag, and moved to the window. I shined the light out, sweeping it across the trees. Nothing, just the thick wall of pines and the endless dark beyond. I told myself it was just my imagination. That's the thing about being out in the woods. You start hearing things, seeing things that aren't really there. But just as I was about to turn away, something moved, a shadow just at the edge of the trees. I froze, staring hard at the spot where I thought I saw it. But there was nothing there now, just darkness. I took a deep breath and stepped away from the window. I felt stupid. It was probably just a trick of the light, or maybe a deer moving through the brush. I decided to ignore it and went back to bed. But the feeling didn't go away. The next morning, I woke up to find something strange. Out by the fire pit, the stack of firewood had been disturbed. Some of the logs had been moved, not in a random way, but almost like someone had deliberately arranged them. I felt a chill run through me. I tried to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe an animal had knocked them over. Maybe I just hadn't paid close enough attention to how they were stacked when I arrived. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I spent the day trying to shake the feeling. I went for a walk, tried to enjoy the quiet, but the unease never left me. I kept catching myself looking over my shoulder, listening for sounds that weren't there. That night, it happened again. I had just settled in bed when I heard it, those same footsteps. This time, they were closer. I sat up, heart pounding. I reached for the flashlight and clicked it on. The sound stopped immediately. I got up, moved to the window and shined the light outside, and that's when I saw it. A man, standing just at the edge of the trees. He wasn't moving. He wasn't saying anything, just standing there, half hidden in the shadows. I felt a cold wave of fear rush through me. I stepped back from the window, turned off the flashlight, and moved as quietly as I could to the rifle rack by the door. I grabbed one of Tom's rifles, though I wasn't sure if it was loaded. I stood there in the dark, listening. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, I heard footsteps again. This time, they were retreating, fading into the distance. I stayed up the rest of the night, gripping the rifle, my ears straining for any sound. By morning, I was exhausted. I stepped outside, half expecting to find footprints in the dirt, but there was nothing. No sign that anyone had been there. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave, but another part of me refused to be scared away. I told myself it could have been a hunter or maybe even Tom. Maybe he had come back late and didn't want to wake me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I made it through the day, but that night, it got worse. I was lying in bed, gripping the rifle, when I heard it. Not footsteps this time, something else. Breathing, right outside the window. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The sound was low, steady, like someone standing just on the other side of the glass. I stayed frozen, heart hammering, praying that whoever or whatever it was would just go away. Then, after what felt like an eternity, it did. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't care if I looked paranoid. I didn't care if it was all in my head. I wasn't staying another night. I never told Tom what happened. I never told my dad either. I don't know who or what was out there, but I never went back to that cabin again. And I never will. I didn't inherit the farm cabin outright. It wasn't some old family property passed down through generations, and it wasn't left to me in a will. I ended up with it through circumstances that, at the time, seemed practical. My uncle had lived there for years, tending to the land, keeping the place running. When his health declined, he moved into a care home, and the cabin was left empty. It wasn't a grand place, just a single-story wooden cabin, set in the middle of a stretch of farmland that had once been productive, but had long since been neglected. The land had overgrown, the fences had started to lean and break, and the soil had turned hard. No one else in the family wanted it. It was too far from town, too much work, too isolated. But I took it. At the time, I figured I could fix it up. Maybe sell it later, or maybe live there long-term if I liked it. I'd been living in the city, in a small apartment, and I was ready for a change. Something quiet. Something where I didn't have to deal with people every day. The cabin itself wasn't in bad shape, at least not structurally. The roof held up, the walls were solid, and it had electricity and plumbing, though both were old and in need of maintenance. The inside was a different story. Dust everywhere, spider webs in the corners, and a smell of old wood and stale air. The first few weeks were spent cleaning. I threw out old furniture that had rotted, swept out years of dirt, and patched up small holes in the walls. The land was another issue altogether. Weeds had taken over the fields, and the barn, which was a good 100 yards from the cabin, had a collapsed section in the roof. At first, I didn't mind the work. Kept me busy, and at night, when I sat outside with a beer, I enjoyed the quiet. There were no city noises, no distant car horns or sirens, just the sounds of insects, the wind in the trees, and sometimes the faint howl of a coyote. But there were also things that didn't sit right with me. Started small. At night, I'd hear sounds coming from the barn. Not the usual creaks of an old building settling, but things moving. Sometimes it sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate. Other times, like something being dragged across the wooden floor. The first time I checked, I found nothing, just the barn in its state of disrepair. The second time, I took a flashlight and a rifle with me, just in case it was an animal. The barn smelled of mold and rot, and the floor was littered with old tools and farming equipment. But nothing was inside. After that, I tried to ignore the sounds. It wasn't until I started noticing things around the cabin itself that I became uneasy. One morning, I woke up to find the back door slightly open. I knew I had locked it the night before. The lock wasn't broken, just undone, like someone had turned it from the inside. Another time, I found footprints in the dirt near the cabin. They weren't mine, too large and deep, like someone heavier had been walking there. They led around the side of the house and stopped near a window. I told myself it was paranoia. Living out there alone in an unfamiliar place, it was easy to get jumpy. Maybe animals had nudged the door open. Maybe the footprints were from a passing hunter. Then I found the knife. It was in the barn, lying on the dirt floor near the entrance. A large hunting knife, old and rusted, but still sharp. I didn't own a knife like that. It hadn't been there before. That night, I locked every door and window, double-checking them before I went to bed. I kept the rifle beside me, something I had never done before. Sleep didn't come easily. Every sound outside made me sit up and listen. The wind against the walls, the creak of wood. Then, just past midnight, I heard it. Slow, steady footsteps on the porch. Not a raccoon or some small animal. Something heavy, human. I stayed completely still, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped near the door. Then the knob turned. It didn't rattle or shake, just a slow, deliberate turn. Testing. I gripped the rifle tighter, my mind racing. Should I call someone? There was no cell service out here. If I fired a shot, would anyone even hear it? The knob stopped turning. Silence. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away, slow and steady, like whoever it was knew I was listening. They didn't run. They didn't panic. I stayed awake until dawn, rifle in hand, every muscle tense. When the sun came up, I went outside, my hands still shaking. There were fresh footprints leading from the porch, heading toward the barn. I didn't follow them. I packed up a bag, took the rifle, and drove into town. I wasn't leaving for good, not yet, but I needed to clear my head. I got a motel room for the night, slept with the lights on, and tried to convince myself I had imagined most of it. The next day, I bought new locks, a heavier door, even a camera, though I wasn't sure how well it would work with the weak power supply. When I returned, the first thing I noticed was the footprints. They were fresh, leading from the barn to the house. Someone had been back while I was gone. Inside, nothing was taken, but the knife was gone. I installed the locks, set up the camera, and made sure everything was secure. That night, I sat in the dark, watching the monitor, the rifle beside me. At 2 a.m., the motion sensor went off. The screen showed a figure standing in the yard, just at the edge of the light. Tall, broad, standing completely still. Watching. I didn't move. I didn't go outside. I just sat there, heart pounding, watching the screen. After a few minutes, the figure turned and walked toward the barn. The next morning, I checked the barn. The door was open, but nothing was inside. No footprints, no sign of anything. Just the old tools and dust. I don't know who was out there. Maybe some drifter, maybe someone who had lived on the land before and didn't want to let it go. Maybe something worse. I left the cabin a week later, packed everything up and never looked back. Whoever it was, they could have it. I never should have gone back to that cabin. I was 36 when it happened. It was the winter of 2017, and I had been working as a construction manager for the past decade. My uncle had passed away a few months earlier, and he left me a cabin out in the middle of nowhere in northern Michigan. I hadn't been there since I was a teenager, but I remembered the place well. Thick trees all around, a long dirt road leading up to it, and no neighbors for miles. It wasn't exactly a luxurious place. The cabin was old, built in the 60s, with a slanted roof and a porch that was falling apart. It had no cell reception, no internet, and the only source of heat was an old wood stove. My uncle had been a hunter, so the place was filled with deer heads on the walls and old hunting gear collecting dust. I had no plans of keeping it. I wanted to sell it, but I had to check it out first, make sure it wasn't falling apart completely. That was the only reason I went there. I told myself I'd spend one night, clean up what I could, and get the paperwork started. I arrived late in the afternoon. The drive had taken longer than expected because of the snow. The dirt road leading to the cabin was barely passable, and I almost got stuck a couple of times. When I finally pulled up, I sat in my truck for a minute, staring at the place. It looked smaller than I remembered, more worn down. The windows were dirty, and the porch sagged worse than I thought. The trees around the cabin were thick and dark. They stretched high into the sky, blocking out most of the sunlight. Even in the middle of the day, it felt isolated. It was dead quiet, except for the occasional sound of the wind moving through the trees. I stepped out of the truck, my boots crunching in the snow. The air was sharp and cold. I grabbed my bag, locked the truck, and made my way up the steps. The front door was stiff, but after a few hard pushes, it finally gave way, letting out a long, slow creak. Inside, the air was stale. Dust covered everything. The wooden floors creaked under my weight, and the place smelled like old wood and mildew. There was an old recliner in the corner, a fireplace filled with ash, and a small wooden table with a hunting knife stuck into it. I set my bag down and went to check the back door. It was still locked. The windows were all intact. That was a relief. At least I wouldn't have to deal with any break-ins or squatters. I started cleaning up, dusting off shelves, throwing away old newspapers and empty cans. As I worked, the feeling of being watched crept over me. It made no sense, but I couldn't shake it. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The place was old and empty. There was no one out here. By nightfall, I had a fire going in the stove. I made a quick meal of canned chili and sat at the table, staring at the old hunting knife still stuck in the wood. My uncle had always been paranoid. He never went anywhere without a knife or a gun. I figured he left it there out of habit. After eating, I checked my phone. No signal. That was expected, but it still made me uneasy. I decided to turn in early. I set up my sleeping bag on the old couch and shut off the lantern. The only light came from the glow of the fire. The wind outside had picked up, and I could hear the trees creaking in the distance. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I remember was waking up to a sound, a sharp crunch. My eyes snapped open. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the walls. Another crunch. It came from outside. I held my breath, listening. The wind howled through the trees, but beneath it, I could hear something else. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through the snow. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding. The sound stopped. I stayed still for what felt like forever, straining my ears. Then, just as I was about to convince myself I had imagined it, I heard the creak of the front porch. I reached for the hunting knife on the table, gripping it tight. Then nothing. No more footsteps. No more movement. Just the wind. I waited for what felt like an eternity before finally getting up. I moved carefully, my socks silent against the wooden floor. I reached the window and peeked out. Nothing. Just the trees and the snow. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe the wind knocked something over. I told myself anything to keep calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I barely slept the rest of the night. Every sound made my skin crawl. Morning finally came, and I forced myself to step outside. My breath came out in thick clouds as I looked around. That's when I saw them. Footprints, deep in the snow, leading from the tree line to my porch. My stomach turned. They weren't mine. Someone had been out here. Someone had been watching me. I packed up my things in record time. I didn't care about cleaning anymore. I needed to get out of there. I locked the cabin and made my way to the truck. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys. When the engine roared to life, I nearly cried in relief. I backed out fast, my tires skidding slightly in the snow. As I pulled onto the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. That's when I saw him, a man standing at the tree line, half hidden in the shadows. Watching me, I pressed the gas harder, not looking back. I never went back to that cabin. I sold it as fast as I could, never telling the buyer what had happened. I still don't know who he was, what he wanted, or how long he had been watching me. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I think about those footprints in the snow, and I wonder how close he got before I woke up. I don't know why I remember that night so clearly. Maybe it's because I still can't make sense of it. Maybe it's because, no matter how much time has passed, I still see her when I close my eyes. It happened in the autumn of 2017. I had taken a short trip to the Lake District in England, hoping to clear my mind for a few days. I was 32 at the time, working long hours at a job that drained me. My boss had given me a rare week off, and I wanted to spend it somewhere quiet. No phones, no emails, just the sound of the wind and the trees. I had found a remote cabin online. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small wooden place tucked away deep in the woods. It was cheap, secluded, and had everything I needed. A bed, a fireplace, a small kitchenette. Enough to get by. The nearest village was about a 40-minute drive away, and I had stocked up on supplies before heading there. The first day was peaceful. I spent most of it hiking, enjoying the cold air, the smell of damp leaves, the distant sound of birds. By the time evening rolled around, I was exhausted. I made myself a simple meal, read for a while by the fire, and then went to bed early. But the second night was different. It had been raining all afternoon, and by the time darkness settled in, the wind had picked up. The cabin creaked and groaned as the storm rattled the walls. I wasn't scared, just uneasy. The kind of feeling you get when you're in a place that doesn't quite feel like yours. I decided to go outside for some air. I don't know why. I guess I thought stepping out might help shake the unease. I pulled on my jacket, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped onto the porch. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. There was a figure standing near the treeline, maybe 30 feet away. A woman. She was barely visible in the dark, but the flashlight caught just enough. Her thin frame, the pale color of her dress. She was completely still. I froze. The rain was coming down hard, the wind making the trees sway violently. But she didn't move. She didn't react to the cold, didn't seem to care that she was getting soaked. She just stood there, watching. I don't know how long I stood there staring at her. A few seconds? A full minute? My brain struggled to make sense of it. There were no other cabins nearby. No houses, no roads, no reason for anyone to be out here in the middle of a storm. I took a step forward, raising my flashlight slightly, but the moment the beam moved over her face, she turned and walked into the trees. Not hurriedly, not running, just walking. Slow, deliberate, like she knew exactly where she was going. I didn't follow. I should have gone inside right then, locked the door, maybe even packed my things and left. But I didn't. I stood there for a long time, staring at the trees, waiting to see if she would come back. She never did. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside made my skin crawl. The wind, the rain, the occasional creak of the trees. I kept picturing her standing there, her blank face, the way she had turned and disappeared without hesitation. Morning came and I felt stupid. Maybe she had been a lost hiker. Maybe a local taking a strange shortcut. I couldn't explain why she had been standing so still, why she hadn't reacted to the cold, but I told myself it didn't matter. Still, I spent the day keeping busy, hiking again, chopping wood for the fireplace, anything to push the image of her out of my head. That night, though, things got worse. I was inside, sitting by the fire, when I heard it, a soft, steady tapping. At first, I thought it was just the wind rattling something outside, but then I realized it was coming from the window. I turned my head slowly, heart hammering. The fire cast flickering shadows across the room, but I could see just enough. A hand, pale fingers tapping against the glass. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The tapping stopped. Then, slowly, the fingers curled away from the glass. The shape outside shifted. A figure moved past the window, disappearing into the darkness. I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace, and stood up. My legs felt unsteady, my breath shallow. I wanted to look outside, to check if she was still there, but every part of me screamed not to. Instead, I locked the door. Then I checked the windows, making sure every latch was secure. I stoked the fire, sat down with my back against the wall, and waited. The rest of the night was silent. No more tapping, no more movement, just the wind, the trees, and my own breathing. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my things quickly, throwing everything into my bag without caring if it was folded or neat. I loaded up the car and took one last look at the cabin. It looked normal, peaceful, even like nothing had happened. But then I saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints, leading from the window to the treeline. Deep, clear prints in the damp earth. Barefoot, I got in my car and drove. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, where I booked a room at a small hotel. I didn't go back for the rest of my things. I didn't care. I never found out who she was. I didn't check the news, didn't ask around, didn't want to know. I just wanted to forget. But some nights, when it's quiet and dark, I still think about her, standing there in the rain, watching. I had been hunting in the mountains for years, but that winter, something felt different. It was late November, and the cold had settled in early. I had a small, old hunting cabin deep in the woods, about 15 miles from the nearest road. It wasn't much, just a one-room structure with a wood stove, a cot, and a small table, but it was enough for a few days away from everything. I had made the trip alone dozens of times before, but that year, something about the silence of the woods unsettled me. The hike in was harder than usual. Snow had come early, and the weight of my pack dug into my shoulders as I moved through the trees. The forest was quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet I was used to, but a dead silence that made the hair on my neck stand up. Normally, I'd hear birds, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, the occasional snap of a branch from a deer moving nearby. That day, there was nothing, just the sound of my boots crunching against the frost-covered ground. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already setting. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, breathing in the familiar scent of old wood and cold air. Everything was as I had left it. My supplies were still on the shelves, and the cot was neatly folded against the wall. I set my pack down, lit a fire in the wood stove, and sat for a while, listening to the crackling of the flames. Outside, the wind had picked up, whistling through the trees. I cooked a simple meal, ate, and then stepped outside for a smoke. The sky was clear, and the stars were brighter than I had seen in months. But the silence remained. I stood there for a while, scanning the tree line, feeling as though something was just beyond the reach of the firelight, watching. I told myself it was nothing, just the stillness of winter, the way sound is swallowed up by the cold. But as I turned to go back inside, I noticed something at the edge of the clearing. A deer, or at least I thought it was. It stood too still, its legs locked in place, eyes reflecting the firelight in a way that didn't seem right. Its head was tilted, just slightly, like it was listening. I had seen deer freeze before, their ears twitching as they listened for danger, but this one never moved, not even the slight shifting of breath. I took a slow step forward, trying to get a better look. My boot crunched in the snow, and in that instant, the deer's head jerked toward me. Not a natural movement, too fast, too sharp, like it had been snapped into place. My stomach dropped. I took a step back toward the cabin, and it mirrored me, stepping forward. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and went inside, locking the door behind me. That night, I barely slept. I lay in the cot, staring at the ceiling, listening. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to a sound just outside the cabin. A slow, dragging sound. I sat up, heart pounding. The fire had burned low, leaving the room in shadows. The dragging noise stopped, replaced by the sound of someone, breathing just beyond the door. I reached for my rifle, keeping my movements slow, careful. The breathing continued, deep and rattling, like someone struggling to pull air through their throat. Then came the sound of a footstep on the porch. Not the light step of an animal. Heavier, human. I forced myself to breathe, gripping the rifle so hard my fingers ached. Then, a knock. Just one. A single, hollow sound against the wooden door. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Another knock. Then silence. I stayed like that until dawn, every muscle in my body locked in place. When the first light of morning crept through the cracks in the cabin walls, I finally found the courage to move. I stood, rifle raised, and eased toward the door. I listened. Nothing. Slowly, I unlatched the door and pushed it open. The porch was empty. No footprints in the snow. Nothing to show that anyone or anything had been there at all. I told myself I was imagining things, that the isolation was getting to me. But as I stepped off the porch, I saw something in the snow. A dead deer, its body twisted, neck at an unnatural angle. Its face, its mouth was wrong, too wide. Its lips peeled back, exposing yellowed teeth that didn't belong to a deer. I didn't hunt that day. I didn't even leave the clearing. I spent the daylight hours chopping wood, trying to keep myself busy, trying not to look at the tree line where I swore I could feel something watching. That night, the noises started again. The slow, dragging footsteps circling the cabin. The breathing. The knock. I didn't sleep. By the third day, I had made my decision. I packed my things at first light and started the hike back. The silence followed me. Not just the natural quiet of the woods, but something heavier, something unnatural. It wasn't until I reached my truck that I let out a breath. I threw my pack in the back, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced into the rearview mirror. Something stood at the tree line, watching. It wasn't a deer, and it wasn't a man. I never went back to that cabin. It was late October when I decided to head up to my uncle's old hunting cabin deep in the Oregon wilderness. He hadn't used it in years, and it was in a remote area where few people went. I'd been hunting before, but never alone. The idea of spending a week out there, isolated, living off whatever I could hunt, seemed like the perfect break from my usual routine. The cabin was about 20 miles from the nearest paved road, sitting at the edge of a thick forest. My uncle used to tell stories about the place, how the land had been in our family for generations, how the woods held strange sounds at night. He never said anything outright creepy, but there was always something in his tone when he talked about it. He stopped going up there after an incident with a trespasser years back. He never explained what happened, just that he didn't feel comfortable there anymore. I packed up my truck with everything I thought I'd need. My rifle, extra rounds, a hatchet, a good knife, some canned food in case I wasn't successful in hunting, and plenty of firewood. I didn't expect cell service out there, so I brought a radio just in case. By the time I reached the turnoff, the sun was already dipping behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the dirt trail. It took another hour of careful driving before I finally saw the cabin. It was just as I remembered, a small one-room structure with a slanted metal roof, a porch with an old rocking chair, and a heavy wooden door. The place had been built solid, but time had worn it down. The paint on the walls had mostly peeled away, leaving the bare wood exposed to the elements. The windows were intact but covered in grime. A few feet away, a shed stood with rusted tools hanging on the walls. I unloaded my truck quickly, eager to get a fire going before the temperature dropped too much. The inside of the cabin smelled of old wood and dust. There was a simple cot in the corner, a small stove for cooking, and a few shelves with supplies left behind by my uncle. A hunting rifle still hung on the wall, the barrel spotted with rust. After getting settled, I stepped out onto the porch, scanning the tree line. The woods stretched out in every direction, dark and silent. I stood there for a long time listening. It was quiet, too quiet. No wind, no distant calls from birds, nothing. Just the weight of the trees pressing in around me. The first 2 days were uneventful. I spent most of my time tracking deer, setting up near a small clearing where I had spotted some tracks. I managed to take down a young buck on the second day, dragging it back to the cabin and cleaning it behind the shed. The work kept me busy, but as night fell, I started noticing little things. The silence wasn't normal. I had camped enough to know that forests are rarely quiet. There should have been owls, the occasional rustling of branches. But every night, as soon as the sun went down, everything stopped. Then there were the footprints. I found them on the third morning, just past the tree line near the cabin. They weren't mine, and they weren't from an animal.
Bare footprints. No shoes, no boots.
Just human feet pressing into the damp earth. They led from the woods to the side of the cabin, then disappeared. I told myself they must have been old. Maybe someone had wandered through months ago before the weather changed. But the ground had been damp from a light rain the night before. The prints were fresh. That night, I locked the cabin door. I wasn't scared yet, just cautious. I had my rifle within reach as I lay on the cot, listening. Hours passed, and I eventually drifted into sleep. Then something woke me. It was soft at first, barely a sound at all. A rustling. Not the wind, not an animal scurrying by. It was deliberate, slow. I held my breath, straining to hear. The porch creaked. I gripped my rifle, heart hammering. The sound came again. A footstep, then another. Someone was on the porch. I forced myself to sit up, moving as quietly as I could. The fire in the stove had burned low, casting only faint light across the cabin. I stared at the door, waiting, listening. The footsteps stopped. For what felt like an eternity, there was silence. Then the doorknob turned. I raised my rifle, ready to fire if it came to that. The knob rattled once, twice, then went still. The weight of the silence pressed down again. I sat there, unmoving, rifle aimed at the door, waiting. Nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the sky began to lighten, I went outside to check. There were more footprints on the porch. Bare feet, leading from the woods, stopping right at the door. I had no idea how long they had stood there, just waiting. I should have left then, but I didn't. I told myself it was a hiker, maybe a lost camper. Someone passing through, curious about the cabin. I had my rifle. I had my knife. I could handle myself. The next day, I didn't hunt. I stayed close to the cabin, checking the perimeter, making sure nothing was missing. The woods felt different now. Every tree, every shadow seemed to hold something unseen. That night, I sat by the fire, listening. And then I heard it, a low, steady breathing. It wasn't inside. It was outside, just beyond the window. I didn't move. I barely even breathed. The sound stayed for what felt like forever, slow and deep, just on the other side of the glass. Then, as suddenly as it came, it was gone. I didn't sleep. I sat up with my rifle in my hands, eyes fixed on the window. Morning couldn't come fast enough. The first light, I packed my things. I didn't bother cleaning up, didn't care about leaving anything behind. I just wanted to be gone. As I loaded my truck, I glanced toward the woods. There, just beyond the tree line, something stood. Person, thin, almost too thin, with skin that looked pale against the dark trees. They didn't move. They just watched. I got in the truck and drove. I don't know who they were, what they wanted, or why they never tried to break in. I never went back to that cabin. My uncle didn't ask why when I told him I was done with the place. Maybe he already knew. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just some lost hiker. And I never wanted to find out what it was. I should have never taken the job. I told myself that more times than I could count as I stood there, the rain pouring down in heavy sheets, soaking through my jacket. My boots were caked in thick mud. My gloves were damp and useless, and my flashlight barely cut through the darkness around me. It wasn't supposed to be this bad. The job seemed easy enough when I agreed to it. A simple construction project, nothing too fancy, just a remote hunting cabin for some rich guy who wanted a private retreat deep in the woods. I was used to rough jobs, long hours, and hard labor, so when my boss asked if I could take a night shift to get ahead on the build, I didn't think twice. It was just another paycheck, another long night. I had no idea what I was walking into. The cabin site was miles from town, way out past the logging roads, in a stretch of forest that barely anyone used. The place felt untouched, like something that had been forgotten long ago. The dirt roads leading there were rough, barely passable in my truck, and with the rain turning them into slick, uneven trails, I nearly got stuck twice. By the time I reached the build site, the rain had been coming down for hours, turning the clearing into a mess of standing water and deep mud. The partially built cabin stood in the center, its skeletal frame exposed to the elements. The walls were up, but the roof was still unfinished, leaving the inside vulnerable to the storm. My job for the night was to work on reinforcing the walls and prepping materials for the next day's crew. Simple in theory. The first few hours went about as well as they could in that kind of weather. I worked under the light of a single flood lamp, hammering, cutting, securing planks where they needed to go. The rain made everything harder. Wood swelled with moisture. Nails refused to go in cleanly, and every movement felt sluggish in my soaked clothes. But I pushed through, knowing that the more I got done, the less I'd have to deal with in the morning. It wasn't until I went to grab more supplies from the truck that I realized something was off. The clearing felt different. I couldn't explain it at first, just a strange sensation that crept up my spine. The kind of feeling you get when you know someone is watching you, even though you can't see them. I stood still, rain dripping from the brim of my hat, listening. The forest was alive with the sounds of the storm. Branches creaking, water rushing through the underbrush, the steady drumming of rain against the trees. But beneath all of that, I swore I heard something else. A sound that didn't belong. A rustling, somewhere just beyond the tree-line. Slow, deliberate. Not the random movements of wind or rain, but something heavier, something careful. I squinted into the dark, my flashlight struggling against the rain. But all I saw was the wall of trees surrounding the clearing. I shook it off. It was probably an animal. A deer, maybe, or a raccoon nosing through the underbrush. This far out in the woods, it could have been anything. I went back to work, telling myself that I was being paranoid, that I was just tired, but the feeling never went away. The longer I stayed, the stronger it got. Every time I turned my back to the forest, I felt it, that same nagging sensation, like eyes pressed against me from the darkness. Every time I stopped to listen, the sounds of movement were gone. Just the storm, the wind, the trees shifting in the rain. By midnight, the unease had settled deep into my gut. I kept working, forcing myself to ignore it, but my hands were shaking, my breath uneven. I told myself I was imagining things, that exhaustion and the miserable weather were messing with my head. But no matter how much I tried to reason it away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. And then I found the footprints. I almost didn't notice them at first, half washed away by the rain. But when I knelt down with my flashlight, my stomach dropped. They weren't mine. They weren't from my boots, and they sure as hell weren't from any animal. They were fresh, deep impressions in the mud, leading from the edge of the tree-line towards the cabin. Large, heavy steps, and the worst part, they stopped right at the edge of the flood lamp's reach. Whoever had made them had stood there, just out of sight, watching me. I shot up, scanning the woods with my light, but there was nothing there, just darkness and rain, the trees swaying under the weight of the storm. I was breathing too hard, my chest tight, my fingers clenched around the handle of my hammer. I wasn't alone. Someone had been out there. Someone had been standing just beyond the light, watching me. I should have left right then and there. I should have thrown my tools in the truck and gotten the hell out of there. But I didn't. I told myself it was old tracks, that they'd been made earlier in the day by one of the other workers, that no one was out there now, that it was just my nerves getting the better of me. I forced myself to keep working, but I was faster now, more frantic. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow looked like something moving in the dark. The rain was getting heavier, hammering against the half-built walls, drowning out everything else. And then the power cut out. The flood lamp went dark, plunging the entire site into blackness. I froze. The generator. It had been running fine all night. No signs of struggle, no flickering lights. It hadn't sputtered or slowed. It had just stopped. I turned, my flashlight cutting weakly through the rain. The generator was near my truck, a few yards away from the cabin. I could barely see it, just a dark shape in the downpour. I didn't want to go out there. Everything in me was screaming to get in my truck and leave. But my tools were still scattered, half my supplies left out in the open. If I left everything behind, I'd have to explain it in the morning. I'd have to admit that I ran, that I got scared. So I forced myself to move, step by step through the mud towards the generator. My flashlight flickered. The rain pounded against my hood, drowning out everything else. I reached the generator. The fuel line had been cut. Not torn, not damaged by weather. Cut. A clean slice like someone had taken a knife to it. My stomach twisted. And then I heard it. A sound just behind me. Too close. Too real. I spun, my flashlight catching movement just beyond the edge of the trees. A shape, a figure, tall, unmoving, just standing there, watching me. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't wait. I ran. Straight to my truck, slipping in the mud, my hands scrambling for the door handle. I yanked it open, threw myself inside, and slammed the locks shut. My fingers fumbled with the keys, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. The engine roared to life. Headlights flooded the clearing, and there was nothing there. The trees stood still. The rain fell heavy. The footprints were gone. I didn't stay to look for more. I hit the gas, tires spinning in the mud, and I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from that place. I never went back. The next day, my boss called, furious about the mess I left behind. But I didn't care. Quit. Whatever was out there, whoever had been watching me, I wasn't going to stick around to find out what they wanted. And I sure as hell wasn't going back into those woods again. That's it. That's my story. It's been years, but I still think about that night. The footprints, the figure in the trees, the feeling of being watched. Some things you just don't go back for. I never should have gone back to that cabin. If I had known what was waiting for me, I would have turned around the moment I saw the first sign of trouble. But sometimes you don't get that choice. Sometimes the road leads you straight into something dark, and once you're in, there's no getting out. It started when I got a call from an old friend, someone I hadn't seen in years. His name was Mark. We used to work together on a logging crew deep in the forests of Montana back in the early 2000s. Hard work, long days, good pay. But over time, life pulled us in different directions. I moved to Idaho, settled into a quiet life doing contracting jobs, and Mark joined the police force. I hadn't heard from him in over a decade. When he called, his voice was off, flat, almost emotionless. He asked if I could come up to a cabin he owned, just outside of Missoula, not far from where we used to work. He told me he needed help fixing up the place, said it was in rough shape after sitting empty for years. I hesitated. Something about the way he spoke made my stomach tighten. But he was an old friend. I owed him that much. So, I packed up my truck with tools, extra clothes, and enough food to last a week, then started the long drive up north. The cabin was deep in the woods, miles from any real town. The kind of place you wouldn't stumble across by accident. The road leading there was barely a road at all, just a strip of dirt winding through thick trees. I arrived just as the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the forest. Mark's truck was already there, parked in front of the cabin. I stepped out of my truck and stretched, taking in the sight of the place. The cabin was old, a one-story structure with a sagging roof and walls darkened from years of exposure. The windows were intact, but the front porch looked like it might collapse if I stepped on it wrong. I expected Mark to come out and greet me, but the place was silent. No movement inside, no sound of footsteps. I knocked on the door. No answer. I tried the handle, it turned easily. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing the dim interior. It smelled of dust, old wood, and something faintly metallic. I stepped inside, glancing around. A small kitchen to the left, a single bedroom down a short hallway, and a living area with a stone fireplace straight ahead. Something felt wrong. There was no sign of Mark. No bags, no personal belongings, just a few old pieces of furniture covered in dust. Then I noticed it, a dark stain on the wooden floor near the fireplace. Dried, almost black. Blood. My stomach twisted. I turned toward the bedroom, heart pounding. The door was slightly open. I pushed it the rest of the way and saw the bed, unmade, sheets crumpled and dark with more of that same dried stain. I stepped back. My hands were shaking. Then I heard it. Car engine not far off. Someone was coming. I moved quickly, slipping back outside just as the vehicle came into view. Police cruiser. Mark's truck was still there. Why would another cop be coming? The car rolled to a stop and a man stepped out. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a sheriff's uniform. He wasn't Mark. He looked at me, then at the cabin. His face didn't change, but I could see something in his eyes. Calculation. He knew. Help you with something? I asked, keeping my voice even. He didn't answer right away, just looked past me, toward the open cabin door. You here alone? He finally asked. I nodded. Was supposed to meet an old friend. He's not here. His eyes flicked to Mark's truck. I could almost see the gears turning in his head. You mind stepping over here for a second? He said, motioning toward his cruiser. Everything in my body told me not to move. I kept my hands at my sides, steady. Why? He took a slow step toward me. Because I asked you to. And then I saw it. On the ground near the steps of the cabin, half hidden in the dirt. A boot print. Fresh. Not mine. Someone else had been here, or was still here. I didn't wait. I turned and bolted for the trees. I heard the cop yell something, then the sharp crack of a gunshot. Bark exploded near my shoulder as I ran. Another shot, closer. I didn't stop. I ran until my lungs burned, my legs aching as I pushed deeper into the forest. The sun was almost gone now, the woods turning dark around me. I could still hear the cop behind me, crashing through the underbrush. He wasn't calling for backup. He wasn't trying to arrest me. He was hunting me. I ducked behind a thick tree, chest heaving. My mind raced. If he found me, I was dead. That much was clear. Mark was dead. I knew it now. That stain in the cabin, the missing belongings, the way this cop had shown up without question. Mark had either found something he shouldn't have, or he'd been part of something he couldn't escape. Either way, they'd made sure he disappeared. And now they were going to do the same to me. I stayed low, creeping further into the woods. My truck was out of reach. The only road out was controlled by them. I had one chance. I moved carefully, staying out of sight. The forest was thick, the underbrush helping to muffle my movements. I needed to find a way to circle back, to get to the main road. Hours passed. The night stretched on, cold and silent. I heard voices at one point, more men searching, flashlights cutting through the trees. I didn't let them find me. By dawn, I made it to a highway miles from where I started. I looked like hell, covered in dirt, scraped up, exhausted. A passing trucker pulled over when I waved him down. I didn't tell him the full story, just that I'd been lost in the woods after my truck broke down. He gave me a ride to the nearest town. From there, I kept moving. I never went back to Montana, never called anyone about Mark. I knew how this worked. They were cops. They could make evidence disappear, twist a story, turn things against me. If I tried to go to the police, I wouldn't make it out alive. So I disappeared. I changed my name, moved to another state, started fresh. But I never forgot, and I never stopped looking over my shoulder. I had been stationed at a temporary outpost for about 2 weeks when the trouble started. It was a remote cabin, barely more than a shack, set deep in the woods of Montana. The department had set it up as a forward operating post for search and rescue efforts and law enforcement in the region. Too many missing persons cases had been piling up. Hikers, hunters, and campers who had ventured too far from civilization and never made it back. The idea was to have a unit stationed out here so we could respond quickly instead of waiting for officers from the nearest town, which was almost 2 hours away. It was just me and another officer, Ray Mitchell. We rotated shifts, one of us patrolling while the other stayed back at the cabin. It wasn't much, just a single-room structure with a desk, a couple of cots, a small kitchen area, and a radio unit for communication. No internet, no cell service. The only connection to the outside world was the radio and a landline that only worked when it felt like it. The first week was quiet. Too quiet. Just routine checks, occasional reports of lost hikers who always turned up before we even had to mobilize. But something felt off. Maybe it was the silence, the kind that pressed in on you at night. No distant traffic sounds. No airplanes overhead. Just the wind in the trees and the occasional crack of a branch breaking under something's weight. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was just adjusting to the isolation. But then things started happening. It began with the noises outside the cabin at night. At first, it was subtle footsteps crunching through the dry leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. I figured it was wildlife. Bears were common in the area, and so were mountain lions. But the noises didn't match. They were slow, deliberate, not the kind of movement you'd expect from an animal just passing through. Felt like someone was out there watching. One night, as I was lying on the cot, half asleep, I heard it again. But this time, the footsteps stopped just outside the cabin door. I reached for my gun, heart pounding, and sat up, listening. The door had no window, just solid wood, but there was a small side window. I moved to it, slowly, carefully, and peered out. Nothing. I waited, barely breathing. After a few moments, the footsteps started again, this time moving toward the trees. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, sweeping the beam across the clearing. The wind was picking up, rustling the trees, but other than that, nothing moved. Then I saw them, footprints in the dirt, leading from the tree line straight to the cabin door. They were human, barefoot. The ground was cold that time of year, nearly freezing at night. No one should have been walking around barefoot. I followed them a few feet before they disappeared into the undergrowth. I stood there for a long time listening. Nothing but the wind. The next morning, I told Ray. He shrugged it off, said it was probably some local messing with us. People don't like cops out here, he reminded me. Maybe some hiker playing a joke, but it didn't stop. A few nights later, I was on patrol while Ray stayed back at the cabin. The roads were empty, nothing but dark woods pressing in from both sides. About an hour into my drive, I got a call over the radio. "Get back here now." Ray's voice came through, low and urgent. I asked what was going on, but he didn't answer, just repeated himself, "Get back here now." I turned the car around and floored it. By the time I got back, the cabin was dark. No lights. The front door was open. I drew my gun and stepped inside. The place was trashed. The desk was overturned, papers scattered. The radio unit was smashed to pieces. But no sign of Ray. I checked the perimeter. No footprints, no signs of a struggle outside. The landline was dead, of course. My patrol car's radio still worked, so I called it in. Backup was on the way, but it would be at least an hour before anyone arrived. I searched the cabin again, slower this time. That's when I noticed something. The cot where Ray had been sleeping was soaked in blood. I followed the trail, small drops leading out the back door and into the woods. I didn't want to go in there, but I had no choice. The trail went deep, I kept my gun up, my flashlight scanning between the trees. The air was cold, my breath visible in the beam of light. After about 15 minutes, I saw something up ahead, a shape on the ground. It was Ray. He was still alive, barely. His face was pale and he was clutching his stomach. There was a deep wound across his abdomen, like he'd been cut with something sharp. I tried to lift him, but he let out a pained breath and shook his head. He grabbed my wrist, squeezing weakly, and pointed past me, back toward the cabin. I turned. There was someone standing between the trees. I couldn't see their face, just a dark shape, motionless. Watching, I raised my gun, but before I could do anything, the figure took a step back and disappeared into the woods. I carried Ray back, dragging him most of the way. It felt like hours before the backup finally arrived. They got him out of there, rushed him to a hospital. He made it barely, but he wouldn't talk about what happened. Not to me, not to anyone. The department shut down the cabin a week later. The official story was that it was a bear attack, but I knew better. I don't know who was out there. Maybe some lunatic living in the woods. Maybe someone who didn't want us poking around. I don't go back out that way anymore. Whatever was in those woods, I never want to see it again. I didn't want to take the job, but work was slow, and I needed the money. The offer came from an old coworker, Jake, who had moved up north a few years back. He said his uncle needed someone to watch over his cabin while he was out of town for the season. All I had to do was keep an eye on the place, make sure no squatters or animals moved in, and occasionally chop firewood for when he returned. It was easy money, and I figured I could use the time to clear my head. The cabin was deep in the woods, miles from anything resembling civilization. The nearest town, if you could even call it that, was Deadwood, a small, dying place with one gas station, a diner, and not much else. Jake told me it used to be a logging town back in the day, but now it was just a forgotten dot on the map. I drove up there in early October, the air getting colder the farther north I went. The road leading to the cabin was rough, just a long stretch of dirt and gravel cutting through miles of forest. It had rained the night before, and my truck skidded in the mud more than once. When I finally arrived, the cabin was exactly what I expected. Old, weathered, and isolated. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering trees, their branches thick and tangled like they had been trying to reclaim the land. The roof sagged slightly in places, the wood on the porch was warped, and the windows were smudged with years of dirt. There was an old, rusted axe embedded in a stump near the front door, and a stack of firewood leaned against the side of the cabin. I let myself in, the door creaking on its hinges. The inside was musty, smelling of damp wood and dust. A stone fireplace sat in the corner, cold and lifeless, and a small kitchen with an ancient-looking stove took up one side of the room. There was a single bedroom with a lumpy mattress and a small bathroom with an old, yellowed sink. I dropped my bag on the couch and set to work. I checked all the windows and doors, made sure the place was sealed up tight, then went outside to bring in some firewood. The sun was already dipping below the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. That first night was uneventful. I made a small fire, heated up some canned soup, and sat on the porch, listening to the forest. It was quiet out there, too quiet. No traffic, no distant hum of a city, just the occasional rustle of leaves or the hoot of an owl. It was the kind of silence that made you feel small, like the whole world had forgotten about you. But as the days passed, that silence started to feel wrong. It wasn't just quiet, it was unnatural. The forest felt like it was holding its breath. I would wake up in the middle of the night and realize that even the insects had stopped making noise. No wind, no movement, just a heavy, suffocating stillness. Then the strange things started happening. One morning, I found the front door unlocked. I was sure I had locked it the night before. I always did. I chalked it up to me being careless, locked it again, and went about my day. The next night, I heard something moving outside. It wasn't an animal, at least it didn't sound like one. It was slow, deliberate, heavy footsteps crunching in the dirt just beyond the tree line. I grabbed the old hunting rifle that had been left in the cabin and stepped outside. But by the time I did, the noise had stopped. I shone my flashlight into the trees, but there was nothing there. The next morning, I found footprints in the mud near the porch. Human footprints. They led from the trees to the cabin, stopped at the front door, then turned around and went back into the woods. I told myself it was just some drifter passing through. Maybe a hunter, maybe some local looking to scare off a trespasser. But deep down, I knew it was neither. There was something wrong about those tracks. Something off. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of the front door creaking open. My heart stopped. I had locked it, I knew I had. I lay still, barely breathing, listening to the silence. Then I heard it, soft, slow footsteps moving across the wooden floor. Someone was inside. I reached for the rifle beside the bed, gripping it so tight my knuckles ached. The footsteps stopped just outside the bedroom door. The cabin was pitch black, the only light coming from the dying embers in the fireplace. I could hear breathing low, controlled. Then the doorknob rattled. I sat up, aiming the rifle at the door. My finger hovered over the trigger. The knob twisted, but the door didn't open. It was locked. A long pause. Then, without a sound, the footsteps moved away. The front door creaked open again. Then silence. I stayed up until dawn, gripping that rifle, my heart hammering in my chest. When the first light of morning spilled through the window, I finally found the courage to check outside. The footprints were back, but this time they didn't lead from the trees. They led from underneath the cabin. My stomach turned. The cabin had a crawl space beneath it, just a few feet of empty space between the floor and the cold earth. I had never thought to check it. I didn't want to, but I had to know. I grabbed my flashlight, stepped off the porch, and crouched down near the edge of the cabin. The opening to the crawl space was just a dark void, a gaping mouth in the dirt. I aimed the light inside. At first, I didn't see anything, just dead leaves, tangled roots, and the wooden beams supporting the cabin. But then, in the farthest corner, something moved. A hand, pale, thin fingers retreating into the darkness. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. My first instinct was to run, to get the hell out of there, but I forced myself to think. If I ran now, whoever was under there could slip out and follow me. I needed to end this. I grabbed the axe from the stump, my pulse pounding in my ears. I moved back to the crawl space and waited, gripping the handle so tight my hands went numb. Then, ever so slowly, a face emerged from the darkness. It wasn't just pale. It was sickly, gaunt, with sunken eyes and lips so dry they were cracked. It was a man, but barely. He looked starved, his skin stretched tight over sharp bones. His eyes locked onto mine, wide and empty. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he lunged. I swung the axe without thinking, the blade sinking deep into his shoulder. He let out a sharp, ragged gasp but didn't stop. His fingers clawed at my legs, his mouth opening in a silent snarl. I yanked the axe free and swung again, and again. Then he stopped moving. I don't remember much after that. I was running, my truck roaring to life, the trees blurring past as I sped down that dirt road. I didn't stop until I reached town, my hands still shaking on the wheel. I called Jake, told him everything. He didn't believe me, not at first, but when he sent someone to check the cabin, they found the body. The police said he must have been living under there for weeks, maybe months. A drifter, a runaway, someone who had been surviving on scraps and rainwater. but they couldn't explain the footprints leading from the trees. They couldn't explain how the door kept unlocking itself. I never went back to that cabin. Never wanted to. I still dream about it, though. The footsteps, the breathing, the way he looked at me, like he had been waiting for me. I never planned on stopping. I was driving through the back roads of northern Montana, trying to make it to a small town before nightfall. The road was long and empty, a narrow strip of asphalt cutting through thick forests on both sides. I had been driving for hours, and the only sign of life I had seen was the occasional deer darting across the road. My gas gauge was creeping toward empty, and I knew I had to find a place to stop soon. I checked my phone. No signal, no GPS. I was alone in the middle of nowhere, and the sun was already starting to dip behind the tree line. Then I saw it. A small dirt road leading off the main highway, barely noticeable among the thick underbrush. A battered wooden sign stood at the entrance, the paint long faded, but I could still make out the words, "Private property, no trespassing." I should have kept driving, but something about the road called to me. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe I was just tired of sitting behind the wheel. Either way, I turned down that dirt path, my tires kicking up dust as I went deeper into the woods. The road was rough, full of potholes and jagged rocks. Branches scraped against the sides of my truck as I moved forward, winding deeper into the trees. I figured there had to be a cabin at the end, maybe an old hunting lodge or a forgotten homestead. Somewhere I could rest for a while, maybe even find an old gas can. After what felt like an eternity, the trees finally opened up into a small clearing. And there it was, a cabin. It was old, long abandoned, with a sagging roof and walls covered in moss. The windows were shattered, and the front door hung slightly open, swaying gently in the breeze. There were no signs of recent activity, no tire tracks, no footprints, nothing. I killed the engine and stepped out, stretching my legs. The air was thick and damp, carrying the scent of rotting wood and wet leaves. The place was dead quiet. No birds, no wind, just silence. I told myself I'd only be here for a few minutes. The front steps creaked under my weight as I approached. I hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open wider, revealing the dark interior. The inside was even worse than I expected. Dust covered every surface, thick cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and the air smelled of decay. A broken wooden table sat in the center of the room, surrounded by old chairs, some of them missing legs. The floor was littered with debris, fallen plaster, dead leaves, and old, unidentifiable stains. I stepped inside, my boots making soft thuds on the wooden floor. The air was heavy, like the place was holding its breath. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, peeling away to reveal the bare wood underneath. In the far corner of the room was an old stone fireplace, the bricks blackened with soot. Above it, a rusted hunting rifle hung on the wall, the wood rotting away. To my left was a narrow hallway leading to the back of the cabin. My instincts told me to leave, but then I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the table, among the dust and debris, was a plate, a white ceramic plate with a fork resting on top. It wasn't covered in dust. It hadn't been sitting there for years like everything else. Someone had been here, recently. My mouth went dry. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was a hunter passing through? Maybe a squatter? I looked around again. The dust was disturbed in places, as if someone had been walking through the cabin. I turned back toward the door, suddenly feeling very exposed. Then, from deep inside the cabin, I heard it. A soft creak. Not the wind, not the house settling. Something inside the cabin had moved. Every instinct told me to leave. I should have turned around, walked out the door, and never looked back. But I didn't. I stepped toward the hallway, my heart hammering in my chest. The floor groaned under my weight, the sound echoing through the cabin. There were 3 doors in the hall, one on the left, one on the right, and one at the end. The one at the end was slightly open. The sound had come from there. I moved slowly, barely breathing. My hands were sweating, and my legs felt stiff, like I had forgotten how to move properly. I reached the door and pushed it open with the tip of my boot. The room was dark. The only light came from a broken window, casting long shadows across the floor. And in the center of the room, something was wrong. The floorboards had been pulled up, revealing a dark hole beneath the cabin. A square opening, big enough for a person to fit through. The wood around it was splintered and torn, as if someone had clawed at it. I took a step back, my breath quickening. Then I noticed something else. The floor around the hole was wet, not with water, with blood. A dark, sticky puddle seeped into the wood, trailing toward the opening. It wasn't old. It hadn't dried yet. My entire body went cold. I turned and ran. I bolted out of the room, down the hallway, through the front door. My boots hit the dirt, and I sprinted toward my truck, my keys already in my hand. But just as I reached for the door handle, I heard it, a low, shuffling sound. From inside the cabin, I spun around. The front door was still open, revealing the dark interior. Then, slowly, something stepped out. I couldn't see its face. It was tall, thin, covered in ragged clothes. Its arms hung at its sides, unnaturally long. It moved slowly, deliberately, its head tilting slightly as it stared at me. I didn't wait. I threw myself into the truck, locked the doors, and turned the key. The engine wouldn't start. Panic flooded my veins. I twisted the key again. The figure was still there, standing at the edge of the porch, watching. Then it took another step forward. I slammed my fist against the dashboard, my breathing ragged. The truck finally roared to life. The figure was closer now. I jammed the gear into reverse, my tires spinning in the dirt. The truck lurched backward, barely missing a tree. I twisted the wheel, shifting into drive. The last thing I saw before I sped away was that figure, standing motionless in the clearing, watching me go. I didn't stop driving, not until I reached a gas station an hour away. I stumbled inside, still shaking, my clothes soaked in sweat. The attendant gave me a strange look but didn't ask any questions. I wanted to tell someone, the police maybe, but what would I say? That I found an abandoned cabin in the woods, and something was living beneath it? That I saw something that wasn't quite human? I never went back. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think about that cabin, about the blood on the floor, about the thing that crawled out from beneath it. And I wonder how many others have taken that same dirt road, looking for a place to rest, and never left.